Hey guys, so in our last video we talked about the unnamed hero, the boy that helped Jesus being able to feed the 5,000. So we're going to continue our talk on heroes. Today we're going to talk about um, heroes of our nation. So in Hebrews chapter 11 and 12, we are called to remember the great heroes of the faith and to remind us that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. The 11th chapter is called the Faith chapter and lists people who are great examples of faith, including Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and Rahab. Then in verses 32 through 34, he adds, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, who I think we'll be covering soon as well, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. All were ordinary individuals of faith, used by God in extraordinary ways to accomplish His will. And that is the story of the birth of our nation as well. The names are different, but include great examples of faith like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Noah Webster, Ben Franklin, Benjamin Rush, William Penn, James Wilson, and of course, George Washington. 4th of July, Memorial Day, really any day, is a time that we need to remember those who went before us, fought for our freedom, and allow God to work through them. What we find is that God makes a habit of doing the impossible through ordinary people like you and me. The secret of living a life that makes a difference is allowing God to work through you like our forefathers did. There are 4 things today that we need to give thanks for. First is their vision. Our nation was founded by people escaping tyranny and oppression, but they were also seeking religious freedom. They had a vision of a land where they could practice their Christian faith without opposition and oppression. The founding of our nation was primarily the pursuit of God, not gold and riches. Those who sailed on the Mayflower in 1620 signed the Mayflower Compact, proclaiming that they had come to the New World to find for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. This was reflected in their first communal actions, which was to have the first public building erected be a church, and the first public exercise was the worship of God. When sorrow came, they gathered at the church to appeal to God for help. When bountiful harvest filled their barns, they gathered at the church for thanksgiving to God. God was the center of their lives. In 1643, as more and more people arrived on these shores, they joined together to form the New England Confederation and wrote the very first Constitution in the New World, which began with these words: "Whereas we all came into these parts with one and the same end and aim, namely to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ and to enjoy the liberties of the gospel in purity and peace." So we give thanks for their vision of a nation birthed out of religious freedom. And that leads me to the second reason to give thanks, and that is for their faith. We enjoy religious freedom today because there were those before us who stepped out in faith, sacrificed everything, and moved to a new and foreboding distant land. As the original settlers died off, many of their descendants were more concerned with increasing their wealth and stake in this land than with being faithful to God and His Word. And other colonists who arrived came for reasons other than their Christian faith and religious freedom. For example, England emptied out its prisons to making it possible for prisoners to come to the New World as indentured servants. And at the same time, the King of England granted vast tracts of land in the New World to his supporters, which became plantations. And then slavery was introduced to the colonies. The spiritual atmosphere deteriorated rapidly. Churches were dying, and many who had once sought religious freedom for themselves were now being intolerant of others, evidenced by the same Salem witch trials. That which had begun for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith had almost disappeared from our land. But then something amazing happened. Beginning in 1734, a handful of preachers, including Jonathan Edwards, Gilbert Tennent, John Wesley, and George Whitefield, came to America to preach in the churches, the streets, and the fields. These soon turned into great crusades and revivals that spread throughout the 13 colonies and became known as the Great Awakening, which lasted for about 2 years. Tens of thousands of people gave their lives to Jesus Christ and were baptized into the faith. So many people came to hear George Whitefield that he had to hold an open air meeting because there just wasn't enough room in the churches. How awesome would that be? That for pastors to have an open air meeting because there wasn't enough room in the church. Benjamin Franklin wrote, "It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. From from being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in the evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street. Once again, the colonies became Christian, as more than 50% of the population were passionate followers of Jesus." Why is this significant today? Well, one, because the Great Awakening needs to happen again. It was a catalyst to the American Revolution. Some scholars believe the Awakening's impact upon the Revolution extended to the foundational ideas of democracy and provided pre-revolutionary America with a radical, even democratic, social and political ideology and evangelical religion embodied and inspired a thrust toward American nationalism. By linking the decision of new birth with his audience's choice of a new American identity, George Whitefield provided a common American experience and identity that unified diverse colonists. Professor Jerome Mahaffey writes, "Without George Whitefield, American independence would have come much later, if at all. This had an impact on our founding fathers, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and authors our Constitution of the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights, and those who put their lives on the line, who fought and died that we might be free because they grew up and came into leadership while this great awakening was engulfing the land. It influenced their lives, their faith, and their politics." Political science professors at the University of Houston collected and cataloged 15,000 writings by the Founding Fathers. Their goal was to determine the primary source of ideas behind the Constitution by identifying what they quoted most often. And what was it? Very simple answer: the Bible. 94% of the recorded quotes of the founders of our nation were based upon the Bible, and it impacted their decisions as well. Author and historian David Barton said the Journals of Congress show that the Founding Fathers opened the Continental Congress with 2 hours of prayer before addressing the pressing issue of British oppression in the 13 colonies. In fact, they also issued 15 calls for days of prayer and fasting throughout the American Revolution. And when George Washington became the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he appointed chaplains to every regiment, recognized that his men needed spiritual nourishment as well as physical, for this was a war that could not be won without faith. Third, we celebrate their desire to do God's will. Behind this desire was the belief of divine providence, that it was not only God's desire, but God's will for freedom from British rule. Professor James P. Bird of Vanderbilt Divinity School studied the sermons delivered by ministers before, during, and after the Revolution. He found that clergy had great impact in inspiring the colonists to fight and die for their country. The Revolution was not just a fight against taxation without representation. It was a struggle against demonic forces as they often preached from the book of Revelation. This as was not new, as the Jews of Jesus' time believed that Rome was the devil incarnate and that their battle for freedom was a spiritual one as well. Believe in God's providence as seen in the prologue of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then, after listing charges against the King of England, they make two more references to God. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world. And then at the end of the declaration, so that's three, and for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. At the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Samuel Adams declared, "We have this day restored the sovereign to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven, and from the rising to the setting of the sun, let his kingdom come." The founding fathers and the leaders of the American Revolution believed that America was protected and directed by God from the very start. Lastly, we give thanks for their sacrifice. The 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence had untold sufferings for themselves and their families. 5 were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons in the Revolutionary Army. Another had 2 sons captured. 9 fought and died from wounds or hardships of the war. 1 had his ship sunk by the British Navy and had to sell his home and properties to pay his debts. He died in poverty. Thomas Nelson had his home taken over by the British for their headquarters. He quietly ordered General George Washington to open fire on it. He died bankrupt. John Hart was driven by the war from his wife's bedside as she was dying. The 13 children fled for their lives. His fields and mill were destroyed. For over a year, he lived in forests and caves, returning home only to find his wife dead and his children gone. A few weeks later, he died from exhaustion. Men and women of our nation have taken oaths of faithfulness and service. They have fought courageously, lived with deprivation, danger, and disease, and took unbelievable risks and sacrifices, all for the good of our nation. Thank you to all of you that have made these sacrifices. We love you. I'll see y'all next time.